As writers, I think we have a lot to learn from the first season of Stranger Things, so I'm gonna break down 11 writing techniques that we can borrow for our own storytelling. And obviously it had to be a list of 11, right? 1. Use red shirts. So what exactly is a red shirt? Well, it's just a minor character that gets killed off early. And the term originally came from Star Trek because everyone who wore a red shirt was a goner. Now in Stranger Things, there are 2 examples of red shirts. I don't think you remember the first one, but I know you remember the second one. In the very first episode of the entire series, there is a scientist running down a hall with flashing lights, and he gets into an elevator, he's obviously scared, and then he gets eaten by a monster. It's a great example of a prologue, and it shows that, hey, this is a show where the stakes are high, like people gonna die. Now the second red shirt example is a beloved character, Barb. Barb is sort of the counterpoint to Nancy, but really, a large part of her role in the story is to die. But why? Why do you want to introduce a minor character only to kill them off shortly afterwards? What this does is it makes the viewer or the reader more worried for the rest of your main characters. If they're willing to kill Barb, then they might be willing to kill Hopper, or Will, or Joyce. Basically, George R.R. Martin's the storyline and puts everyone on edge. The second technique we can learn from Stranger Things is multiply your antagonists. I think most writers usually think of the antagonist, like a singular antagonist in their book. But what we can learn from Stranger Things is you can have multiple antagonists. The first one you probably thought of is the Demogorgon. If you crossed a Venus flytrap with a bodybuilder and gave it anger issues, that would be a Demogorgon. And the second one is Dr. Martin Brenner, who basically abducts kids with special powers and then treats them like lab rats. I think it's really important to have both types of antagonists, right? Both the human antagonist and sort of like a monster antagonist as well. The monster antagonist gives you this very visceral, animalistic fear, while the human antagonist gives you this kind cruelty that's just torturous and psychologically painful. And I should add that there's even more sub-antagonists. You have Agent Connie Fraser, who goes around assisting Brenner in various ways, and you also have the bullies at school who picks on Mike and the rest of the gang. Essentially, don't be afraid to have lots of antagonists in your story. Number 3, choose curiosity over mystery. So if you were writing a character like Elle, who has these amazing superpowers, I think a lot of writers would try to keep that a secret for a little while, you know, to keep the reader guessing. But instead, in Stranger Things, they show her powers basically right away. In one of her first scenes, when she's getting fed in a diner, she looks at a fan and concentrates on it and shuts it off with her mind. Showing that up front rather than keeping it a mystery makes readers very, very curious about how those powers will develop in the future. So later on, when she ends up, you know, flipping a car or something super powerful like that, it makes sense because we realized from the beginning that she had powers. 4, employ misdirection. So the central problem in the entire first season is that Will is gone, right? He's been abducted by a monster. And everyone is searching for Will, wondering whether he's dead or alive. So what misdirection does is it leans away from the way the story's gonna end. It tries to convince the reader or the viewer that things are gonna turn out differently than they actually will. So at the end of the season, spoiler alert, Will's found, right? He's alive. What that means is the storyline has to work really, really hard to convince you he's not gonna be alive. They're gonna find him and he's gonna be dead. So how do they do this misdirection? Well, they find Will's body in the quarry. I mean, this is very strong misdirection. They literally find his body. Of course he's not alive. And then later, Hopper realizes it's just a fake body. It's just cotton fluff and lies in a kid-shaped package. So in your story, just work really hard on misdirection and try to convince the reader that what they want to happen in the end is not what's going to happen. 5, make superpowers have a cost. So every time that Elle uses her powers, what happens to her? Her nose bleeds. And there's a very good storytelling reason why her nose needs to bleed. I mean, really, it's showing that she doesn't have unlimited cheat codes, right? There's a cost to every time that she uses her powers. If her powers don't have a cost, then there's not much tension in the storyline, right? We're just like, oh, let me guess, she's gonna use her powers to get out of this one. But if her powers have a physical cost, then we wonder, is this one gonna be too much? Is she not gonna be able to win in this confrontation? It's also a great visual sign that she's using her powers. Like sometimes you don't know whether she's using her powers, like when the bully pees himself, and then you look at Elle and you're like, oh, nosebleed, okay. I guess that means she's using her powers. And honestly, a lot of superheroes that you see have some sort of downside to their powers. I'm thinking like Rogue and X-Men. Yes, she can absorb other people's powers and memories through skin contact, but it comes at a very high personal cost for her because she can't safely touch people that she loves. 6. Create contrast. There is a great scene in the first season where there is a contrast between Barb getting murdered by the Demogorgon and Nancy's little smoochy going on with Steve. Now, the innocence of that romantic scene makes what's happening to Barb even more horrific. And you want to look for places where you can do that in your own fiction, to smash two very different storylines together so that the contrast is really sharp and really makes a distinction. This reminds me of the scene in the second Matrix when you have the machines burrowing down and trying to kill all the humans, and you also have Trinity and Neo making love. And it's such a wonderful contrast between like the rigid duty of machines and the possibility of affection and love with humanity. Now you might be thinking, oh, this is only a cinematic technique, how do I pull this off in a book? But I have read books where you'll have a paragraph where every single sentence alternates to a different scene. For example, one sentence describing the sensory aspects of the scene, and then the very next sentence is more like a philosophical pondering on it, and then back to the sentences, and then back to the philosophical pondering. Or you can do it with two completely different scenes and every sentence is jumping between the two. 7. Offer love triangles. So Nancy is torn between Steve, who is kind of a douchebag but has amazing hair, and Jonathan, who is kind of nerdy and dweeby, but he is exceptionally kind. Now, whenever I bring up love triangles as like a good strategy for writers to employ, I always get a lot of pushback, and I think it's because readers have been burned by bad love triangles. And by bad love triangles, I just mean ones that manipulate the reader rather than being organic choices between two options. Anyway, I am holding firm to my line. I really do think love triangles are such a fantastic device and you should use them in all of your fiction, whether you're writing romance or not. But what a love triangle does is it gives anticipation to the reader or to the viewer. They want to know, who are they gonna choose? And the arc of this love triangle is turning away from Steve and turning toward Jonathan. Bad love triangles often don't have that story arc. They usually present two options and then just keep us there in limbo for as long as possible. 8. Use a theme. So the strong theme in Stranger Things, as you probably know, is Dungeons and Dragons. On a marketing side, this is genius, right? Because it provides a very loyal fan base. But it also provides all these different layers of interpretation. You have the Upside Down, which is kind of like the Plane of Shadows. You have monsters that they name with terms from Dungeons and Dragons, like the Demogorgon, like the Mind Flayer. So what this does is it creates this whole mythology that enriches the storyline and allows people to sort of geek out online and be like, ooh, look at all these fun things that I found. Look at all these different ways you can interpret the story, not in terms only of itself, but also in terms of like the original source material of Dungeons and Dragons. If you can find some source material like that for your book, I would recommend that you use it. Number 9, be nostalgic. Don't be afraid to fully embody a time period in your book. Stranger Things goes full force into 80s nostalgia. There's no cell phones, they're biking around in the dark. There's Cold War fears of Russian spies. And of course there's Agos, Lego my Ego. Not only that, but we have a ton of allusions to movies of that era. We have tons of E.T. references, like when they're trying to bike away from the agents in the vans, and then Elle flips that van. You have allusions to movies like Jaws, which if you read interviews with the writers, they say that Jaws actually inspired the Demogorgon. You have touch points with movies like Goonies. I mean, Dustin as the comedic relief is very Goonies-like. And there's also some Stand By Me vibes. So really embrace the time period that you're writing in and find ways to make it feel like that time period. And don't be afraid to allude to a lot of other storylines as well. 10. Unite your diverging plot lines. What's great about Stranger Things is you have a lot of different plot lines, but everyone is very busy and active trying to solve the problems in their own ways. For instance, you have Jonathan and Nancy buying monster fighting gear and then going out and trying to find this monster. You have Mike and the boys going out and investigating mysterious areas with Elle. And then of course you have Joyce, who set up all the Christmas lights and is trying to like contact her son through this very seance-y way. But eventually, and this is something you have to think about, is when you have all these different storylines, at what point do those storylines converge? And how do they converge? And where do they converge? At one point after Jonathan gets in a fight, he and Nancy end up combining their knowledge with with Hopper and Joyce's knowledge, and suddenly they're a little bit closer to solving the problem. But I will say that you need to be very careful about where this takes place in the storyline. Their pooling of knowledge takes place about 3/4 of the way through the storyline. And here's our very last one, number 11, in honor of 11, how not to botch a cliffhanger. So I hear all the time about how angry writers are when there's like a horrible cliffhanger at the end of book 1 and they have to buy book 2 to figure out what happens. I think your goal as a writer is not to make people angry. Yes, you want them to buy book 2, but ultimately you want them to feel satisfied in your story. So let's look at Stranger Things to figure out how to do a cliffhanger well. I think the way to look at the ending of season 1 is to look at which storylines are closed off and which storylines open up. The storyline solves the main plot problem by having Will rescued. The storyline also solves the main antagonist by having the Demogorgon defeated. The storyline solves the main love tension by having Mike finally profess his love for Elle. And we also get this wonderful character change with Steve, where at the beginning he's sort of like this awful human being, but then he becomes courageous and actually like fights the monster. So there's all these storylines that close up very neatly and in a very emotionally satisfying way. There's just one little cliffhanger. Will's in the bathroom and he coughs up this weird mucusy slug-like thing that's from the Upside Down. And so we're wondering like, oh, what does that mean? Is it a cliffhanger? Yes. Is it an emotionally abusive cliffhanger? Absolutely not. We wrapped up all the storylines with season 1, and yet because of that little mucusy snail thing, we're still looking forward to how season 2 will develop. I hope analyzing Stranger Things helped you solve problems in your own book, and to solve more problems, check out the next video.